I'm Rebecca Hyde, a 2017 Nuffield Scholar and Director at TFD Consulting, and I'm joined here today by 2018 Nuffield Scholars Kate Scott and Turi McFarlane, who we're going to talk through their findings from their Nuffield reports. So Kate is a founder and director of LandPro Limited, a planning and surveying company she jointly founded in 2017. And Kate has just recently founded Ground HQ as well. And Turi McFarlane is from Banks Peninsula in Canterbury, and he's a senior farm environmental consultant at Ravensdown and has a background in agricultural science and extension as well as natural resource management. So welcome, guys. Can you, Turi, just give us a brief overview of what it was that you studied during your Nuffield year?
Yeah, absolutely. Kia ora, Beck. So my Nuffield topic essentially considered the optimisation of farm systems for sustainable outcomes in agriculture. So through my, year of research and travel, 5 key themes came out of that. The first of them, I'll just give you a brief summary. The first of them was around farm planning, so farm environmental planning or farm management planning, like we often call it in New Zealand. And I got the opportunity to actually dig a bit deeper into a few examples of that. In my report, I covered off one in Victoria, Australia, New York State and Alberta, Canada, and some really interesting opportunities and findings around the value of farm planning and how we might be able to frame that up within the New Zealand context to seek holistic outcomes, so considering environmental, economic, social, cultural aspects. Another sort of second key aspect that I looked into was that of climate smart agriculture. So that's a sort of a concept which considers agriculture within the context of climate, looking at productivity, so emphasising the importance of productivity in the agricultural system, resilience to the effects of climate change, as well as reducing the impact of agriculture on climate change, which I thought was a really constructive way to look at that as compared to a lot of the conversations we often have, which are around just reducing emissions or reducing agriculture's impact on climate change. The third one I looked at there was sustainable management practices, so similar to what we kind of call good management practice or good farming practice, and just the value that I see in that, providing some clarity and some direction for farmers who are often finding themselves in quite an uncertain landscape at the moment with policy changes and bits and pieces. But in and of themselves need to be based in really good science and informed by good modelling, which lead me to my next point in my studies, which was around the value of good tools to help, modelling tools to help in the optimisation of farm systems. So I see some real value in that, being grounded in good science and helping inform farmers make some really good decisions about how they might configure a farm system and what sort of land use that might be, depending on their range of different factors or where they're based. And finally was sort of an interwoven theme in that around extension and just how important effective extension is, and saw some really amazing examples of that overseas where universities might work in with federal and state government to achieve some really neat outcomes, and just how that, when it's prioritised, can actually help achieve some really good things on the ground. So in a bit of a nutshell, that's covered off a wee bit of it, I think.
Yeah, good. Oh, some pretty good key findings there that I'm sure we can explore a bit more over the next wee while. And Kate, if you can just cover off what you looked into.
Yeah, kia ora, Beck. Thanks for having us here today. My research was looking at enabling better environmental outcomes in agriculture. So taking my perspective as a resource management planner, dealing primarily in the primary sector and seeing the continual change that's coming farmers' way, in particular around increasing regulation and needing to make changes to manage the effects of their activities. And I guess what I was wanting to look at was to understand, were there some better approaches being undertaken elsewhere in the world that we could apply to New Zealand to understand how we might enable those better environmental outcomes. And in doing so, had the opportunity to travel to, I think, all up 16 or 17 different countries, and saw a really wide variety of practices at play there. And I guess what I had identified when I looked in New Zealand was some of the barriers, particularly to enabling that environmental change and that move towards greater sustainability, with things like the fact that we often operate in silos. So we've got all these sector bodies that are doing great work, but often are doing it alone without that cross collaboration. Also identified the fact that we have a very heavy regulatory system here, and that, in my view, that's often stifling innovation and the ability for people to, well, I guess it disincentivises that approach to change and innovation. And so I went and had a look at a whole bunch of different things, and I guess one of the heartening things of my research was the fact that when I went and had a look at other intensive agricultural nations throughout the world, for the most part, New Zealand's actually doing a really great job in that space, and it was heartening to actually see that. And whilst that doesn't mean we haven't achieved everything that we need to achieve, in my opinion, we were a lot further ahead than many other nations, because we at least recognised the fact that we needed to make change to ensure that our agricultural systems are sustainable into the future. So that was a great finding from being able to go out and have a look at what was happening elsewhere in the world. And in terms of recommendations in my report, I came up with 4 key recommendations, and the first one was focused on the fact that we need to enable and foster robust conversation and debate. So the ag sector is facing a huge amount of pressure from a range of different areas, environment, GMO, you name it. There's all these burning topics, climate change, that until we actually start to have adult conversations around what the impacts of these things might be, how are we going to actually move forward? And one really interesting example that I observed during my travels was the Irish Citizens Assembly model as an approach to facilitating robust conversation free from, I guess, the constraints of judgment. It was about, here's the information, make an informed decision, and I thought that was a really interesting concept that could be utilised here in New Zealand. My second recommendation focused on the fact that, in my view, we really need a overarching strategy for sustainable agriculture in New Zealand. And I think until we actually have a clear plan of where we're going, then how do we actually achieve what we want to achieve without that direction? So that's something that I firmly believe we need to continue to get that bipartisan cross-sector engagement and delivering a kind of a really, I guess, aspirational outcome. And perhaps that's focused on New Zealand, the world's most sustainable food producer, and being able to actually take it to that next step and prove that we can do that. The third recommendation that I highlighted in my report was the fact that we need to have more collaborative science. So we have, again, a whole bunch of science work being undertaken, but it's not always targeted or direct to what's needed at a farm scale to drive that change towards sustainability. So we go and focus and study our science on these cool things, but they're not necessarily related to that overarching goal of whatever it is we're wanting to be as New Zealand agriculture. And then the final recommendation was, in my view, we need to really move towards redesigning our approach to policy. And that's about shifting from having a top-down reactionary approach to a ground-up supportive approach. So how do we take farmers and growers with us to support them to make change that's from the ground up, because it's going to be far more enduring than simply piling regulation on top of people all the time. So I guess that's kind of, in a nutshell, the sorts of things that I took the opportunity to study when I was travelling as part of my Nuffield.
So both of you guys talked a bit about a holistic approach, that we need to change what we're doing with a more holistic approach. What is our first step towards moving towards a more holistic approach to do things?
Yeah, great question. From my point of view, when I link that back to the work that I undertook, for me that comes back to having those robust and facilitated conversations. So unless we can actually open up the conversation with all the information on the table and understand all of the different players that sit around that, I don't think we can move towards a truly holistic approach. Mm-hmm. Would be my take on that.
Yeah. Turi, have you got anything?
Yeah. I mean, if I sort of work that towards a little bit of my study, I think farm planning's got a huge opportunity in that space. I think by looking at any one thing in isolation, we may not get sustainable outcomes. So I think by truly looking at farm planning as an environmental, economic, social, cultural, I think there's a real opportunity in that to become more holistic and actually to align better with farmer goals and set them up in the long term to succeed and make investments that are going to succeed. I also think from a science perspective, so research, development and extension, we should be looking more at farm systems, so not at individual, which I think one of the points you made as well, Kate, that not looking at too many individual components, but trying to wrap our head around how that works in a farm systems context. So we can understand if that's economically viable, we can understand what the synergies are between, water quality and emissions, so we can get that big picture, and that just doesn't happen. It's quite complicated and it does involve some specialist skills, but I think that's the real opportunity.
I think it's about understanding how the whole actually, can't operate without all the component parts. So, you can't, your action here has a corresponding action somewhere else. And if we just focus on, one aspect of farming, be it pasture or be it the environment, we actually discount all the other components that actually make your system sustainable. So I agree with you, Turi, that we really need to be taking a whole of farm approach to actually be able to drive sustainability.
So through your travels, were there some specific examples that you saw that were showing that holistic approach, or a direction towards that holistic approach that we're not probably doing here in New Zealand just yet?
From my point of view, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I mean, there was certainly the odd example of at an individual farm scale that I observed where people were trying to apply those principles of, sustainability and taking a holistic approach at a farm scale. But I certainly didn't probably see it occurring in a much wider capacity than that.
Yeah.
One of the things I think is worth us thinking about in the New Zealand context at the moment too is that catchment scale approach, and there were a couple of examples I saw in New York State where they had some collective issues, some collective priorities that actually working together around, I think, helped work towards, if you want to call it holistic goals and values. And I think there is a real opportunity in that in New Zealand, and there's obviously a bit of a groundswell here at the moment around catchment-based initiatives, and I think that would be potentially quite a useful opportunity for us as well.
That for me is where it comes back to this need to have this overarching strategy for agriculture, because if we don't have that common goal that we're all trying to achieve, then how do we actually get everyone on the same page and heading in the same direction? And that's about creating that buy-in and that opportunity to actually move towards with a common goal, to your example in New York in many respects.
Yep.
Yeah. So 2018, we had the formation of the Primary Sector Council, and we've now had Fit for a Better World released. Is that a step in the right direction towards this holistic approach? And what more where do we head to next now we have got a overarching direction?
From my point of view, I think Fit for a Better World was a really great starting point, starting with that big picture and vision. And look, I'm not close to the Primary Sector Council and not involved in it, but my understanding was that their ambit was not really to look at creating a strategic plan, but just to set that vision. And I think they actually did a pretty good job bringing a variety of views around their table to land at something that actually, should provide that impetus for change and for people to build on. And I guess, I sit back here as an observer and say the opportunity actually now lies around how do we take that to that next step and actually continue to build on that momentum and continue to foster, cross-sector or, collaboration to actually drive that change. So, let's see what brings over the next period of time. But I think that there's plenty of opportunity in that space to take it to that next level.
Cool. So what are some key aspects relating to on-farm environmental management that stuck with you during your travels?
Good question. I think probably to take a bit of a different look at it. When I went overseas, so much of the big red flashing light here for us is around water quality, and it opened my eyes absolutely to the importance and the perspective different countries and cultures put on aspects like on-farm biodiversity, the importance of ecosystem services and how that relates to individual farms and catchments and wider communities, and concepts around actually payment for those ecosystem services and how different countries are approaching that. Climate smart agriculture, which I touched on a little bit at the start, that was a new concept for me to get my head around, and actually stuck with me through my travels about being a bit more of a constructive way to look at emissions in agriculture from my perspective, that it considered productivity, it considered actually resilience to the changing of climate as well, which I think we don't do near enough in New Zealand, and saw some really good examples in Australia and other places where they really are prioritising that, and I think it's something we want to get our head around. So probably for me it was broadening my perspective beyond some of our more traditional things that we think about when we think of environmental risk and management around soil conservation and water quality, but to some of these other topics that are priorities for other areas and cultures. So, yeah.
One thing you just touched on there was ecosystem services. Can you just expand on that a bit more and explain what you mean by ecosystem services?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I mention ecosystem services, I essentially mean some of the so-called services in the environment around what they provide for the wider community and society. So that might be pollination, that might be regulating services, it might be food, it might be fibre, but essentially recognising the components in an ecosystem and how they relate back to the community around them.
Cool. So a good opportunity for us to be expanding more on those ecosystem services and valuing what they're actually providing to our wider community.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's quite a positive message for farmers too, because I think a lot of the environmental conversation it can often feel very one-sided, and it can feel like, you're always being sort of interrogated on issues rather than reflecting on a lot of the ecosystem services, a lot of the benefits that you provide for yourself, for the community, for the wider country as well.
I guess that's about how do we change that conversation to make it more positive and more engaging. And I think as soon as we can start to create that positive engagement around what we're doing at a farm scale, it actually helps to create that buy-in across all of our communities to understand the value that agriculture can actually play.
So what about you, Kate? You were looking more from a planning point of view. So what were some things that stuck with you during your travels around planning?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that stood out for me was the fact that compared to almost every other country that I visited, New Zealand probably has the most stringent planning regulation attached to controlling the way that farmers farm. And so I guess what I found is that there weren't a lot of examples to necessarily draw on to the way in which we might apply that directly, except for to understand that there's an opportunity to, in my view, if we want to get enduring change, continuing to require people to go through all these rules and processes related to that, is that actually the best use of our time and our resources when we could be spending more time on actually helping to educate, support and drive that change from the ground up? Because I think that's about creating understanding at a farm level of, firstly, what are the impacts of their activities, but secondly, how, most farmers that I work with, are magnificent custodians of their land, and as soon as they understand that the way that they're doing something might be having an effect, they want to do everything they can to change that. So how do we drive that without everyone, having the stick all the time? And I think that's my perspective, is the planning process that we have to go through these days are so complex. It's really challenging for many people to do it without the input of an expert. And sometimes, it sounds a little bit perverse, but sometimes that money would be far better spent on addressing the actual challenges and issues on the ground rather than having a piece of paper telling you what you should or shouldn't be doing.
So are we too far down the track to try and change something there, or where can we head from where we are now to get to a better situation around that planning?
Look, I think I don't think we've nailed it yet in New Zealand. In my view, we still have far too much regulation, but having said that, I have observed probably even over the last 12 months, a little bit more of a shift around, yes, we're rolling out more regulation, but this trying to roll out the extension services alongside that. And I think, again, it's not a perfect model yet, but I guess, Turi, that links into some of the work you're doing is how, if we're bringing regulation, do we then support that with on-farm support, extension, and actually, make, long-term and enduring change towards that.
So I suppose that there, Turi, how do we get that extension better included into some of these more mandatory plans that we've got in place already?
Yeah, good point. I mean, I think regulation poses challenges to that inherently because, people don't always like to be told what to do.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
like the opportunity to figure something out and find a solution themselves.
Well, and it can stifle innovation, and that's one of the biggest barriers I see from bringing increasing regulation to the mix, is that it actually stifles that innovation and those people that actually want to find a new way to do it, because the very tight constraints of what the rules say they can or can't do don't really allow for that.
Yeah. I mean, an example might be farm planning. We talked a little bit about earlier on. So increasingly that's being regulated across, different regions and now through national regulation. And I can understand why they've done that. Personally, I think that the greatest value in that is for it to be a voluntary option for farmers, but I do know why they do that because I see the value in the tool. But I don't think that negates the opportunities around that, in that we shouldn't be blinkered by domestic regulation. And yes, that's a minimum standard and we should all be meeting that, because it's been set hopefully for good reason. But I think the opportunity there remains for processors, for industry groups and for farmer groups to actually look beyond and look to our consumers, look to, the global situation we're in, and, what is a priority for them? How can we make the use of these tools and actually go beyond regulation and add value around producing sustainable food and fibre, and aligning really clearly with our customers. And I think the other component of that becomes really important is proving that. So that traceability, so that transparency around what you're doing, so that's where some of these, farm assurance programs plus, whatever come into their own, and I think become really important. And we need to make sure we've got some strong expectations around that, so that we and growers and farmers can really feel that,
and consumers can actually see that.
And we've got confidence in it ourselves, and therefore hopefully consumers.
And look, that's where I see there's a huge role to play for this whole technology and data space. And that was one of the findings I looked at, is that there's a whole bunch of barriers to the uptake of technology at the moment, but in terms of this traceability and proving that we are sustainable and capturing that is going to be one of the ways that we're actually going to be able to capture the value for what we're doing and set the price effectively of what we're doing, is as soon as we can start to record, demonstrate, audit, prove what we're doing and how we're doing it, then that actually creates so much opportunity for New Zealand to be able to continue to be world leaders in the produce and the food and fibre that we're actually producing.
I think there's no doubt that there's a lot of opportunities at the moment, and but it's how do we harness these? And I think something you'd mentioned earlier there as well, Turi, was about extension and how some of the universities in that overseas are teaching it. Where are opportunities here in New Zealand to be improving our extension programs?
Yeah, look, it's something I've wrestled with quite a bit, and in some of my previous roles had quite a bit of experience in extension, and something I really enjoy. Fundamentally, I think we've had quite a significant focus in the past around research and development, and that extension arm has sort of been either tagged on or not given the credit it deserves. And at the end of the day, it's all very well coming up with great science, but if people can't understand it or can't apply it to their context, we've got a real problem. So I think we need to start taking that really seriously. And to be honest, since we came back in, when was it, 2018, the government and MPI have taken that more seriously, and it's great to see some more initiatives out there in the extension space. I still think it's something we need to look at in its own right, extension, and look for ways for universities, CRIs, government, industry to work more together in that space, and specifically focus on extension. I think there are some great programs out there, industry-led programs that seem to be doing a really good job. So how can we better support them, better support farmer-led catchment group opportunities that, have a lot of people with some fire in their belly and are going after something that makes sense for them and for their region. So just aligning, I suppose, and better resourcing that link between tertiary education sector, government and industry for farmers in the middle.
Yeah. So this is just a question that I've got here. So in your experience, did you see different responses under a regulatory approach versus an extension approach in driving change in environmental practice on farm? So where that mandatory versus voluntary?
Yeah, so I didn't look wholly at the extension side of things, but certainly in a couple of places I visited in the UK, there was a real emphasis on, there was this voluntary component of if you actually meet the standard from an environmental point of view, there's actually a price premium attached to that. And so there was it was a monetary incentive to do it, but actually they were going out to do it for a range of reasons because they could see value to their farm system as a result. So I think certainly my experience and my observation, even working with my clients here, is those that choose to go in and take up extension or undertake, for example, in some regions that I work at the moment, it's not mandatory to have farm environment plans, but those that have engaged in that process voluntarily have seen huge value from it. And what they're driving, because they've taken a broader, more holistic approach, is typically higher production, higher profitability, better animal welfare, all those outcomes that they've decided there's merit in chasing for their own benefit rather than because someone's told them to do it. So certainly my observation is that we get, those people are engaged in that process. And I think what doesn't come from the regulatory piece is the engagement, because to your point, Turi, people feel like they're just being told what to do.
I agree.
So that's, my personal view is we're going to get a far better outcome.
Yeah. So it's how we're approaching it as individuals.
It is.
Yeah. Do you have anything more to add on that, Turi, around the
Not really.
regulatory versus voluntary?
To be honest, no, pretty similar thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think there's too much more to add.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll just look at a couple of points that you guys talked about in your reports, and one of them was around this climate smart agriculture.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe you could just expand on that a little bit more around what that is and what are some examples of where we're starting to look at that here in New Zealand.
Yeah, okay, yeah, cool. So I was fortunate enough in my Nuffield travels to get along to COP24, which was so the Conference of the Parties, the 24th Conference of the Parties, so it's essentially a UN climate conference. And yeah, that's where I sort of first actually heard about this concept of climate smart agriculture. And basically it's an idea that was being promoted that prioritised three key pillars in that, and one of them was productivity, one of them was resilience to the effects of a changing climate, and one of them was reducing agriculture's contribution towards climate change. And I mean, for me, that was just a lot more of a constructive way to frame that conversation and not isolate out one particular component, because I think in our context at the moment, quite often the whole conversation is either around net or gross emissions in agriculture, right? It's and that's this whole debate seems to be around, and to be honest, at the exclusion of our resilience to climate change. And we're seeing dramatic climate differences from north to south at the moment, and down the east coast. And when I look at, as I said before, countries like Australia, which are putting a lot of effort into the effects of a drying out in different areas, the effects of fire and what have you, I think that's something we need to get a lot more smarter about. So when we think about that, and when we think about our farm systems, what should they be in the next 5 years? What should they be in the next 20 years? So when we make investments, we're making smart investments for the long term. And productivity, as well as reducing emissions, we need to think about these things in the context of making a profit as well, right? So we can be profitable and do what we need to do at the same time.
I think the whole concept of climate change or total emissions at a farm scale is really hard to grapple with, whereas if you actually wrap around the concept of climate smart agriculture, all of a sudden it means something to farmers that they can relate to and their own farm system. It's a concept. It's far easier to apply that to their personal situation than thinking about, gross emissions or Paris Accord targets, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's right. And I think more engagement will be there because as a farmer, you feel like, the productivity is recognised, we are recognising that we need to move towards, a future that's changing. So it's not just one aspect that keeps getting banged over your head, but, people are taking into consideration some of those other things which are important to farmers as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's a good point too around, farmers have always been known for their changing and innovation and climate's something that they're needing. It will just continue to change. So if you're farming with that focus of a climate smart agriculture, it gets you in a better mindset to be able to adapt to those
rather
changes.
than seeing climate change as this huge barrier that you can't overcome because you don't understand it and it's complex.
Or that climate change is going to come and then you'll get through it. Don't think it's going to quite work like that.
No, I don't think so either.
So look, I think the Nuffield is very much about, the report is a big part of it, but it's also about the experiences that you had. So if you can just give an example, one of your sort of standout experiences that you had during your travels to share with us.
From my point of view, one of the real highlights was the opportunity to travel as part of the Global Focus program. So you get to travel with, in my case, 10 other, there was 9 other people, so there was 10 of us, and you do a 6-week tour around a range of different countries. And probably the value for me in that was the fact that you form these lifelong relationships with people, but actually the opportunity to go and see all these amazing things that are completely outside of what a farming system might look like in New Zealand. So for example, I travelled to Brazil and we went and we visited this farming enterprise called Bom Futuro, which is the world's largest privately owned family farming enterprise. And, in their cropping business alone, I think they have something like 220,000 hectares within their cropping business. So the scale of that was just next level. And what's great about travelling with 9 other people is that you get 9 other views. So, it wasn't very often that everyone was asleep in the van when you were travelling around because you actually got so much stimulation and so much perspective from having 9 different people who bring a different perspective to the table. And I probably found that the most rewarding aspect of my travels. And when I then had to go and travel on my own, sometimes it was a bit of a letdown trying to have that same conversation with myself about all the cool things I saw today. So that's a real highlight for me.
Yeah, no, and I'd certainly second that as well. What about you, Turi? What was a stand-up for you?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to sort of nail one, isn't it?
It is.
Think back on it. But I think it was actually taking me out of my comfort zone in your sort of sphere of interest or, engagement. So, working and living in that natural resource management, environmental space, it was great to engage on the GFP, with a group of 9 different scholars who were, experts in cereal production or, producing great lambs or whatever it might have been, and then visiting world-leading farmers around the world that, had 500,000 hectares of cereal or, a subsistence farmer in Kenya that, welcomed you with open arms and took you into their house and showed you exactly what they do and why that's important to them, through to, a hazelnut grower in Oregon, something that you just would never do by yourself, but you have the opportunity to do and engage with people that are interested and passionate about it and want to share that story with you.
Yeah.
So just an opportunity you actually just would never get any other way.
Well, and that's the amazing thing, I think, is that the doors that open that, you just wouldn't be able to rock up and see these things if you just knocked on the door. And that was,
true.
Yeah. I think the other thing too there is that you wouldn't consider going to see a hazelnut grower.
Because it's not part of what you do every day.
Yeah. No, that's great. Now, just one final question. So as a Nuffield scholar, what do you see as the opportunities to be leaders within the New Zealand food and fibre sector going forward?
Opportunities to be leaders. Look, I think we touched on it a little bit before. I think the unique opportunity with Nuffield is that you get this global perspective, right? Quite often the things we do in the day-to-day, the nature of it is everyone's busy and you can get in your little silo and you can think that's everything. And going out into the world, taking the blinkers off and actually realising that there's a whole lot more going on there. Different cultures have different values, trying to get your grasp around that, trying to appreciate what we're doing and how that fits into the bigger picture. Like, we're an exporting nation. So I think it's important that we do get that perspective of our consumers and the rest of the world. And look, I think the opportunity for leadership revolves around that, and that unique opportunity that I guess we've had to experience that and bring that back home to New Zealand. And then I guess, the challenge is on us to apply that. Things just don't happen. So, very grateful for the opportunity, and I think, it puts you in very good stead for a range of different things, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. Look, I agree with all you've said, and I guess, the point that comes to mind for me is about that ability to, go out and see the world and create perspective and understanding, and that opportunity is actually what you make it at the end of the day. Like, we've been bestowed this huge honour and opportunity to be Nuffield scholars and represent, our country, and I think the opportunity is being able to give back to the whole of our agricultural sector and the New Zealand primary sector to actually continue to foster this change and growth, and how do we make sure we now stand up and help to lead that next generation of change and leaders, and that giving back and fostering that. And that's, for me, is probably one of the things that I get, the greatest reward out of is actually, I've had this amazing opportunity, so how do I now go about facilitating and sharing those learnings, but helping others to have a similar experience. So I think, that's for me is what some of the opportunity embodies.
Yeah.
And you get to meet really cool people. And that's, that's the most amazing thing.
Yeah, no, definitely. Hey, well, thanks very much, guys. And I suppose if anyone wants to look up your reports, they're on the Rural Leaders website.
Yep.
And thanks very much for your time.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.